Hello and welcome to another episode of Virtual Coffee with Ashish, which is part of the Cloud Security podcast. Today's topic is another identity and access management. And it is an important topic from a lot of perspectives, especially if you talk about cross-account in AWS. So before we get into the topic, for people who are coming in for the first time, we have a show on, Virtual Coffee with Ashish or Cloud Security podcast released every Sunday, 8 a.m. Australian Standard Time and 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for the US folks. It's a weekly show. We talk about cloud security. We talk about everything under cloud security. We just demystify topics for cloud security. So without further ado, today's topic, identity and access management. I have someone special from here. He's probably my first Brazilian guest. It's only now, as I'm talking to you guys, I realized actually, it's my first Brazilian guest, so no pressure. Let me just bring him on.
Ashish. Hello. Thank you for having me.
I just realized you're my first Brazilian guest for this. So, like, no pressure at all. You're representing Brazil, or you're setting the standard for Brazil over here.
I'm representing the entire country right now, all 100.
Yeah, totally. Like, no pressure at all. That's amazing. I've got a couple of people who are saying hi as well. So I think you can see the chat window up here, I imagine. So I've got Arun. Hey, good morning, Arun. Good morning, Vineet. I think we have a really good support group over here that people join in and tune in, even though it's super early in Australia. So I'm looking forward to some of the questions from those guys as well. But I'm super excited to have you.
Thank you.
I prefer Alex, but
Alex is going to be a lot easier. It would be Alexandre, but Alex.
Alexandre. Oh, I love the pronunciation of that name. I just want to say, I don't know why people don't say Portuguese with a sexy accent, but Alexandre sounds like a bit better. So for people who don't know you, who is Alexandre?
So I've been an entrepreneur in information security since the 2000s. About that time, founded a company in Brazil called CyberSecurity, co-founded a company in Brazil called CyberSecurity, which grew to be like a major player locally, both in consulting. We had an MSSP, and actually this company raised capital and expanded. We had an office in London and an office in the US as well, started growing internationally. Eventually sold my shares of the company. I mean, I still have a great history there and love it. It has been since sold to a Spanish company. But then I founded a company called Needle, which was a SaaS service running entirely on AWS. That was a security service, which is basically meant to use machine learning and threat intelligence to automate the work that security analysts do on a security operations center as far as monitoring and triaging of alerts. Right. That company was later sold to Verizon. I was the CTO of that company. I had two co-founders. I worked for a little while at Verizon at their global product, leading the product management team responsible for their Detect portfolio of the managed security services for Verizon, which is either number 2 or number 3 in the world as far as managed security services go, depending on who you ask, which analyst.
Yep.
And then I decided to be an entrepreneur again. And I just recently founded Tenchi Security, which is a company that's strictly focused on cloud security. Because I realized something flipped in my head, especially with the experience of selling a company to a company as big as Verizon, going through all the due diligence they do as far as the technology go and security-wise. They were pretty thorough on their evaluation. Not that they would have a history of buying a large company that had a security incident. They didn't find out during the due diligence or anything. But they were really, really cautious. I'm talking about the Yahoo deal, of course. And yes. And so they were really, really thorough. And Needle was a company of 6 people. I alone basically did all the ops for an AWS environment. And we passed without anything, without any yellow flags even. Wow. And it really struck me how easy it was. How much easier it was to have something that would pass the muster of that kind of scrutiny with so few people, because we were automating almost everything, right? And there's no way we could have done that with traditional technology, on-premises technology, or it would have been orders of magnitude more difficult and more expensive. So something flipped on my head. And also after I went to the first reInvent saying, I think we're going through a change here that we haven't seen such a big shift in IT, in my opinion. since we went from mainframes to like Novell networks, right, with microcomputers. And I'm old enough to remember people that went through that transition, right? And so this really said, if you're doing security today, you're not focusing on cloud security, I think you're kind of already behind. And that was the idea behind founding Tenchi.
Oh, interesting. And I think, sorry, I should have started off with this, but since it's virtual coffee with Ashish, cheers. Oh, nice. All of you. Is there a particular kind of beer?
It's a Brazilian beer. It's like standard beer. It's 7 p.m. here, but it seems like a summer day, though it shouldn't be. It's really hot, so cold beer is great.
Wait, because I don't know of any Brazilian beers. I want to know, what's the name of this beer?
That one is named Skol. It's not a particularly good one, but if you ever do come to Brazil, my friend, I'm going to show you some really good premium Brazilian beers. We do have them here. A lot of Germans emigrated to Brazil, a lot of Italians and Japanese. So one of the interesting things about Brazil is that we have like some of the best Italian food in the world, some of the best Japanese food in the world. If you think about why Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is such a thing, and we have so many martial arts in Brazil, is because we have the largest population of Japanese people outside of Japan. It's like actually in the city of São Paulo, where I live.
I did not know that. Well, dude, we definitely need to explore quite a bit of that, but maybe I'll save it for a longer conversation. A couple of more people joining in. I've got Irene, Gerald. Morning, folks. We've kind of touched on cloud security just said before we cheers. And what is your definition of cloud security? Obviously, everyone has their own version. So keen to know what's your version.
I think what's happening is we're talking about IT security in a sense. And what's happening is the IT foundations of IT are shifting beneath our feet. As I said, of course, information security is the same since the age of the mainframes, but the way you apply it to IT changes as the technology changes, right? So you did one thing on the mainframe, and then when you went to like an LDAP, directory, to control privileges, the way you thought about how you manage privileges, the way you thought about how to apply patches, it changes completely because of the way the technology works. And cloud is changing things. It's not just another kind of data center. You're not just doing the same things the same way, but you don't own the hardware, right?
Right.
It really gets me irked with people that do that thing where, it's just other people's computers. No, it's not. You either don't know how IT works or how cloud works, if you're saying that, right? So it's just not, because the thing that's really changed in my mind, and it has a lot of interesting consequences that are not immediately obvious unless you study the subject. There's a lot of things that were not automatable that are now. So if you wanted to have a new computer, and on an on-premises environment, you had to go for procurement. You need to receive the hardware, has to be, entered into the correct place on the data center. You need to open a ticket, so a human from cabling goes there and put up the cable, and someone logs into a core switch and, assigns an IP address or puts that new port onto the correct VLANs. And so it would take months even before you could have a machine. And there was no automated way of doing that. It was a sequence of steps that involved sending emails, making calls with people, opening tickets, humans doing things. And the fact that this can now be just, an EC2 call away, that you can just stand up a new instance and it happens in seconds, which is great for agility. But it has security implications as well, because it can both good and bad. The control plane is what I'm getting at. The automation, the APIs, the cloud security vendor APIs, they are a new attack surface. There are ways we can do automatically now that we couldn't before. And so security has to protect that. Whereas before, there were so many checks and balances in human processes that if you all of a sudden, started asking for, if you tried to buy like 100 of the most expensive computers ever, this would require a VP approval, and someone would catch it. If you were, think about cryptocurrency miners, right? What do they do with a cloud account? They come in and they start running very expensive machines.
Yeah.
What if that happened on the on-prem world? There would be a procurement process where they get approval, and at some point someone validates that, and that doesn't happen.
That's right.
That went away with the cloud. So that's the bad side of it.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, there's a lot of upside for security, in the sense that asset inventories,
Hmm.
A huge problem. There are entire companies whose sole job is to help you go into an on-prem environment and try to create and maintain an asset inventory, because this is hard. On the cloud, you just call the APIs. And at least you may not go into maybe what's inside the operating system, but you know exactly what machines there are, the network, the subnet. It's all there to be listed in real time.
Yeah.
Right? So that's
Yeah.
one problem that completely went away if you use the APIs. You can automate patch management or even get rid of it entirely if you use the shared responsibility model in your favor and adopt managed or serverless
Yeah.
architecture.
Yeah.
Right, where you don't have to manage the operating. That's like a complete game changer for security, right? Where you
It
can
is.
automate steps and you can even get rid of tasks that would be like undifferentiated heavy lifting for IT,
Mm.
and that create a ton of pain, like patching. How
Yeah.
many companies get owned because they were lacking a patch? And not because they're stupid or because they're lazy. I'm not here for victim blaming, because it's hard,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And even for patching, just another quick example on how the cloud changes things dramatically. Why do most companies fail at patching? There are a ton of reasons, but there's one very practical one that I found very often, which is I don't have a test environment. I don't have a replica of this system that I can stand up and safely test this patch. And if it breaks, I didn't damage anything that was in production, because no one buys, they don't have a clone of their SAP infrastructure, which is really expensive as far as hardware and storage.
Yeah. Even from a license perspective, you're looking at a lot of costs at that point.
In the cloud, if you set that SAP server with infrastructure as code, let's create this on the test account, a copy. Let's put up some data, or even replicate the production data. You shouldn't do that, but you can, right? Just replicate the database, apply the patch and see if it still works. And then tear it down and you stop paying. You didn't pay like a huge sum of money to have it sitting idle there for just when you need patches, to test patches. So it's really revolutionary in a lot of ways. They're non-obvious, right?
Yeah, and I think to your point, a lot of people are not utilizing it enough as well. So that's a great definition. To your point about the digital assets and how the world has kind of evolved from a cloud perspective, a lot of the opinions we had as security folks initially, to your point about procurement processes, that doesn't really exist anymore. If I've given you access to an AWS account, or any account for that matter, whether it's Azure or GCP, you just have free reins based on the permission you have. Which is a good segue into identity management and the different kinds of identities that can exist and the challenges that come with identity. So I've got, I guess the audience that we have is obviously have experience in an on-premise world, also have experience in cloud world. So we have few people who are quite experienced, and we have a few folks who are starting off in cloud security or starting off in security as well. So from an identity management and AWS perspective, if we can explore the whole federated, how I guess IAM user, like what is all that? Like what? And I usually say there are like 4 kinds of users, but keen to know if you feel the same and if you have another version.
Mm-hmm. So I think the contrast I'd like to make with AWS and Azure really helps, right? And we're very much used as IT professionals, especially if you're in the corporate world. Like if you're in a startup, that's different. But if you're in the corporate world, and you're really used to that model where you have like a Windows network, essentially, you have Active Directory. So you kind of have a separation of systems, and there's this separate place where the directory is, where the users are, the group definitions, the privileges are defined either on the directory itself or in the relationship between the directory and the system, right? So it depends on a case-by-case basis. That's not how AWS was structured, because it grew organically from the bottom up. They didn't start with something as structured as far as IAM goes. So in AWS, each AWS account is self-contained. Like everything lives inside the account. So if you're a programmer, you can think of an account as kind of a namespace, right? It's an encapsulation that's all encompassing, right? So if you're inside of an account, there's very few exceptions where you see other accounts. Everything happens inside your account. So the assets are inside the account. the users or the identities that are going to access those assets are there, and the permissions policies you assign are all inside the account. That's not the case with on-prem systems. If you have a typical Windows network, right, where you have AD servers, domain controllers, where users and credentials and typically access privileges live, and then you have like the file servers or the SAP server or other servers that are using that as a reference, and it can be separate. In AWS, they're inside the same account. Azure does the same thing as the on-prem stuff. So they have like the Active Directory tenant, where you have that the users, the groups, the permissions, and then you have the subscriptions. I think would be like the closest parallel to AWS accounts. They also have resource groups and have other kinds of entities, but the same user exists outside of the subscriptions, and then it can have privileges on several subscriptions. It can have a single password, log in with that user that exists on the Active Directory tenant in Azure, and then you can have privileges and with the same API calls talk to things that live on different subscriptions, provided you have the privileges. On AWS, you're doing API calls as one AWS account at a time. Every time you do an API call, every time you have an access key into AWS to call an API, that belongs to one and only one AWS account, and you're living inside that sandbox. And so it really it's a different way of thinking if you're coming from an on-prem world, right? So that's it requires some thought. The way I think about why AWS did this is think of sharding, right? So when you think about databases, where they're trying to distribute the data across multiple servers to be able to do load balancing, I'm thinking AWS did that to make their data centers and their infrastructure more scalable, right? So if you have very little interaction between accounts, like the account is a unit where they have to keep everything concentrated in their infrastructure, right? So something along those lines. It must make their infrastructure easier. But it's a different mental model than we're used to on both on-premises and even other cloud providers, like GCP with projects where they have the project structure that, again, a project would be the equivalent of an AWS account maybe, or subscriptions in Azure. So that right off the bat, AWS is unusual in that sense. They did their own thing, right? That's not similar to the mental models we had in the past. And they're not using RBAC either, which is another thing that you would expect coming from other environments. It's we
definitely want to get into RBAC as well,
Yeah. AWS is very identity-centric and not so much group-centric. Like groups in AWS IAM are very limited. They're very poor, very underdeveloped. And I wish it wasn't. We can get into that if you want to, but I don't know what you have next on your list.
No, so from your perspective, so I think it's a great definition. I think worthwhile calling out your experience as a trainer kind of gets highlighted over here as well, because you're able to kind of come from a place where a lot of tech folks have come in from. Like everyone knows I guess everyone who's been in IT for some time knows that they get an Active Directory account. And it's funny because earlier, when I was trying to do pen testing or in that space, the only thing people would care about was, I want to get domain admin, right? That was the thing. If you get domain admin, oh my God, porn, everything's like, I own everything. But that concept doesn't really exist the same way in cloud. It's a very different terminology. You're calling, you want a root account access. Which is not like domain admin. Still different because you could have multiple organizations. We can go to the layer of complexity, but to your point about where people have come from, and this is probably where some of the challenges come into the space as well, where people kind of still think about actors like, I've got a privileged user and I've got a regular user. That's it. Or I've got some kind of a script user of some sort. So keen to know from your side, I guess, if you can explain a bit more about if you're starting today as a security person in a cloud environment, from an identity perspective, what are the kind of questions you should be asking, or what should you be looking at? Like what's the best practice? Let's go start with that when you talk about privileged and non-privileged users.
So let's start with, the first things are the same everywhere, right? So there's some concepts that you have to maintain, right? So you will need, it's not just about the technology, there are processes involved, right? So you need to make sure that whatever processes you have around how do I get approvals to create a new user, assign someone different privileges, change their roles, terminate their accounts if they're left the company for some reason, etc. All of this has to continue to work, right? Applying least privilege and need to know and those things, it's really critical. What's changed is how you do it, and the fact that this is really new technology. The privileges are different. They're more complex. They're completely new kinds of privileges, completely new kinds of services and assets. And so your IT infrastructure, your admins, your access control teams, your service desks are probably going to make more mistakes and are going to be more vulnerable because of the lack of knowledge. There's a steep learning curve. Just sheer number of, I think the last time I saw like AWS IAM actions for policy, I think it's 7,000 or something, right? Some of those are really dangerous. Some of those, allow you to do privilege escalation like crazy. But there are 7,000 of them. Who knows them all, right? So how can you hope someone doing a review knows everything if you haven't extensively trained them, if you haven't automated that analysis to some degree, right? So I think that's what changes. But here's what I would recommend. I'm going to talk more about AWS, which was the focus of the talk and an environment I'm more familiar with. But the thing that you need to keep in mind is that we're talking about a new attack surface. We were used to doing access control already, and we need to leverage the existing process as much as possible. So let's start from there. The first thing I would look into, if you are a company adopting cloud, or if you already adopted cloud but still early days, how do I piggyback what I already have? Right. So you probably already have a corporate directory, right? You either use Active Directory or maybe no value directory or something else. You use some IDP, like identity provider, external identity provider, whatever. Leverage that, because you probably already went through the pain of creating processes and automations, or even have an IAM product that's helping you manage the workflows of people inside that directory. And if people are terminated, that user on the directory is going to be deleted or disabled. And so you get a lot of stuff for free. So for AWS, that means you need to look into using AWS SSO, which is a horrible, horrible name for the service, a single sign-on. Because it's impossible to Google anything about it. If you do AWS single sign-on, every single IDP that integrates with AWS is going to appear before the documentation of the freaking service, right? So it's horrible. It's horrible, right? But it's an amazing service, right? And it does two things. One, which you do not care about, which is it acts as like an identity provider, so you can use it to authenticate against other products. Forget that. What you're really interested in is using AWS SSO to integrate to your existing directory. So if you use G Suite, you can have, instead of people needing to have like IAM users inside each AWS account, they can log in using their G Suite credentials. Right, on the web. They can do like a single sign-on transparent. And then you assign them privileges to each AWS account that they need to access, right? And you can do the same with Active Directory. And when you use Active Directory, the integration goes even further. So you can even assign privileges to Active Directory groups. So when you move a person inside Active Directory into an existing Active Directory group that already has AWS privileges, next time they go into the AWS SSO link for your organization, they're going to have those privileges. So there's a lot of leverage you can get and a lot of mileage you can get out of those services by piggybacking on your existing processes. So don't reinvent the wheel, keep it simple. And the reason why SSO is an even better idea is because it makes a lot easier to have multiple AWS accounts, which is, I think, another concept that we talk about a lot on the network level, which is segmentation, right? And compartmentalization, we talk about on coding. The same thing should apply to your AWS environment. You should have, there's this concept of reducing the blast radius. So assume someone can escalate privileges into that account, right? For some reason, you gave someone an excessive privilege, someone exploited a vulnerability, whatever, and they gain full access to that AWS account. If you minimize the amount of systems and data into each AWS account, the damage that attacker can do is now contained, is reduced. So it's containing the blast radius. That's the idea. So what I typically recommend to customers, so there's this concept of a landing zone, and AWS has a full service called Control Tower. that can help with that, and they already propose this minimum idea of having like a security account where all the logs get sent to the security logs like CloudTrail, etc. And you have a shared services account, which every other account can see. And then you will have the different like business systems accounts. And I would recommend, if you're developing internal systems, for example, to have one AWS account for System A production, System A staging, System A development. So 3 accounts for each system, right? At least. And then you keep them separate. In
right.
That sense.
So keep the radius. I mean, I guess, decrease the blast radius of a potential incident by having separate accounts. Just want to quickly acknowledge some of the comments that are flowing in. I think we've got a few regulars over here. So hi, I'm just trying to quickly go through. Hi, Gerald. Hi, Lucas. Hi, Paul. Hi, George. George mentioned an interesting point about you can still do a lot of damage using domain accounts. So I'm like, yep, actually, hybrid accounts, it's still a thing. Your domain account is still pretty much can give you access to something else. Especially if you have single sign-on, you can get access to your AWS account through that. So thanks to single sign-on these days, you get credentials everywhere.
That's the flip side of using single sign-on. There's an advantage of not having to manage multiple passwords. But the downside is once that one password is compromised, you're screwed because the attacker has access to everything, which is why you should 2FA all the things. All things.
Yes.
Not some of the things, not most of the things, all the things.
I think it's so interesting, right? I feel like nowadays you can't have a conversation about identity management without talking about 2FA. Just the whole username password or username access key, if you want to go IAM user or one of those users, it's not enough these days. Like, and especially because we haven't touched on cross account yet. We've only spoken about different kinds of account. Now, if we dabble into cross account, which I would love for you to do, a pause like Azure apps. That is true. There is the we spoke about Azure apps in our last podcast meeting. So it's an interesting concept, which is very different to
roles.
It's kind of similar to what IAM users are, but it's an interesting concept. I guess where I was trying to get to with this was also the fact that it's also the cross-account aspect, not having 2FA, an IAM user, if they have access to, say, multiple, or not just multiple, like all your AWS accounts, sometimes people have 50 plus. Like, that's a real problem. And I think you had a great talk on this topic about the power of cross accounts. Would love to, if you can probably dabble into that a bit for people who may not have heard of this before. What is cross account, especially for people who probably are coming from an on-premise world and they're going into the cloud space? What is cross account and why does that even matter in this context?
Of course. Just before we do that, let me just drop in a little stat here, which I think is really interesting, why this subject is relevant. The DBIR, the Data Breach Investigations Report that Verizon has published for the last 12 years, right? The 2020 edition mentions that 77% of the cloud breaches they studied involved breached credentials, involved the misuse of credentials. So someone had hacked and obtained illegal access into the account. So that's why protecting those credentials is really important. But let's get to the cross-account aspect of things. So the way in which you can, there's a lot of scenarios where you need to have access to different accounts in AWS because, as I said, AWS accounts are self-contained. If you are separating your environment into multiple accounts, you might have a scenario where you must have account A access a resource on account B. Like, so I gave an example of centralized logging, right? So you might need just or to save backups because you don't want to have your main data and the backups living on the same account. If someone becomes the root of that account, they can delete the data and the backups, and then you're having a really bad day, right? So you want to have your backups on a separate account, right? And so you want to allow account A to write data into, let's say, an S3 bucket of account B, right? So you need to have cross-account access. And the other scenario where that is really, really being used is when you talk about SaaS service providers. There's whole classes of SaaS services coming up to help you manage, monitor, or even provide security for your cloud accounts, where you have a company. Let's talk about CSPM, for example, which was the subject of your last issue, right, of the podcast. CSPM product, in a sense, you can think about it as kind of a vulnerability scanner for the control plane, right? It's looking at the way control plane services, cloud services are configured and reporting bugs. So it needs to access your account. It needs to call the cloud provider's APIs and see how things are being run and configured on your AWS account. How is that done? There are many ways in which you can do this, right? So the simplest way you can think about it, and is the parallel of using Azure apps, which be I could create an AWS IAM user. That user, I would create credentials, so an access key ID, secret access key, and I would give them via like a secure channel, because those are really, really easy to find, to your SaaS provider, right? And so they would save those credentials, and they would use that whenever they needed to call APIs on your account to find out if you have any public S3 buckets, or if you have any users that don't have 2FA enabled, things like that they want to alert on. They would use those credentials to call APIs on your behalf. They would have whatever privileges you assign to that IAM user, and they can access your environment. The problem with that is that then what this means is that this one vendor will have to store all of the credentials of all the accounts it can access. So if you're talking about a large company that's maybe has thousands of customers, each with tens of accounts, you're easily talking about there exists a database somewhere where tens of thousands of valid, possibly high privilege, AWS credentials exists, and that just becomes like a huge beacon, and for attackers, that's a huge prize for an attacker. Or if that leaks, man, because information security is hard, right? Even well-meaning, well-funded, competent vendors, things happen. A backup is leaked. Someone accidentally posts something somewhere. One of their ops people gets their laptop compromised. Someone gets access to the account where those passwords are stored. Those keys are stored. So it's really, really a very big risk concentrator.
Yep.
AWS offers a different way of doing things. There's an alternative where the SaaS vendor is not required to store secrets. It's not required to store credentials, right? So the way this works, and this is something that really comes up on the security certification exam for AWS, by the way. So anyone thinking about taking this
is a good hint. Yes.
exam, look into this, right? So you can, on AWS, there's this concept of a role. And the way that I think about a role is a user that has no credentials. There's no way you can log into the console as a role directly. There's no password that you can set, so you can log in as a role. So it's like a fake user. And you could think about it the way you would have like a service user on a Linux machine, that you disabled the shell, you disabled a password, but you can sudo and become that user, right? So the concept of roles is that you can have a fake user, you assign privileges to that fake user, and then you can assume that role. You can temporarily become that role. And the way this works is every time you call the assume role API, that API will return temporary credentials that can last anywhere between, I think, 1 hour and 12 hours. That if you then start calling AWS APIs with those temporary credentials, they will have all of the privileges you assign to that role. And you can do that inside your own account, right? You can have inside your own account, you can create a role. You have a user that has very limited privileges. And every time they want to do something more advanced, they have to assume a role, and then they use the temporary credentials that role gives them to do the more dangerous things. That could be, again, equivalent of requiring someone to do sudo before they can do a system change on a Linux machine, right? But the fun thing is that you can now allow account A to assume a role in account B. So roles, they have a permissions policy, which, once you assume the role, what can you do? Those are the permission policy. But you have what's called a trust policy, saying who can assume that role. So it looks more like a bucket policy. It's a resource policy in a sense, saying who can assume this role. And you can put there another AWS account ID. And the thing is, you don't need any secrets to do that, because AWS is making the trust transitive, right? So you are authenticated into your account, right? And you are a SaaS vendor, you are a CSPM vendor, okay? You are Ashish CSPM, right? And I configure a role in my account saying that I trust your account.
Yep.
So when you do assume role, you call, when your account, you call assume role and say the role you want to assume is my role. You're going to give it an ARN, an identifier of the role that includes my account ID and the role name I created for you. AWS does all the magic. We don't need to establish a password amongst ourselves. AWS knows that you are authenticated to your own account. Then AWS goes to check on my account that I trust your account, and that it allows the call to get through. And then you get
a handshake.
Temporary credentials into my account. And then you can use those temporary credentials to start inspecting things on my account. So it's really tricky to think about it, but it's genius. Because the thing is, if I have 1,000 customers, those 1,000 customers each trust me as a SaaS vendor, right? Or they trust you. Let's not confuse things. You are the SaaS vendor, right? So if you have 1,000 customers and all of those 1,000 customers trust your account, you don't need to store passwords for any of them. Every time you need to do something, you obtain temporary credentials, keep them only in memory, do the thing, and then kill that machine. Those credentials are gone. They disappear. They're not stored anywhere that could leak. Someone would have to hack into your account or hack into those worker machines that are doing the magic and keeping those things in memory and steal them, which is arguably a lot harder to do.
Yep. I think I have an interesting scenario on this, and I'm pretty sure AWS hasn't necessarily solved this problem yet. I think for reference, we're talking about STS service from AWS, which is that
token service.
Temporary, that's right. So now I can have that as an IAM user as well. And what I found amazing is the fact that when you do request an STS token, it doesn't get recorded. Like there is no console view to the fact that, Alex has requested a session token, a new set of session from his access key.
So the call to assume role does get logged on CloudTrail, which is what you would need. So in order to obtain temporary credentials, you would need to call assume role. There's a few versions of assume role that work differently. I'm describing like the main assume role. You can
Sorry, I meant more in terms of, say, for example, Alex has requested a session token. I see that he's requested a session token. But if you have, somehow, I think we said like it's valid from an hour to, I think it's the longest period is 3 days or whatever the longest period is, because you can set that up. What I found interesting was the fact that if Alex has requested a session token, I can't see that he's requested a session token. So it would not come up as a list, say, under Alexander in the console anyway.
On the console. Yeah, you would need to go into the logs to see that. Yeah.
And I found that really interesting. Yeah, because to your point, it's so multi-layered because you kind of have like a view which is only in console, and there's another view which is only in CLI, or I guess a bit more in CLI, which is, by the way, which is probably a good segue into the question that came from Vineet about, does biometric authentication, is that ideal for an account access? I don't know if it's even possible to have a biometric authentication. It's like MFA. Can you have, I think a YubiKey probably is the closest thing you can go for a hardware token? Or can you go for a biometric?
It's interesting. I'm not a huge fan of biometric myself, but if you have a second factor of authentication, you're probably way ahead of the game. Even if it's just SMS, it's way better than just using password. It's like a huge increase. And I know every authentication method has flaws, but it's funny to me. Biometric is much more an identification than an authentication measure, because it's telling the system who you are and not proving that you are who you are, because your fingerprint is not a secret. The government has your fingerprint. Anyone that can take a picture of you up close can have an image of your iris, and so you're broadcasting that information. You pick up a glass and your fingerprint is in there. So I would think about biometrics much more as a way to prevent something like password sharing, because then you have to identify yourself much more than you're proving that you are yourself to the system. But that's just me. If you look at the CBK for the IC square, or if you look at people that know a lot more than I do, they consider that one of the 3 authentication factors. But I actually think it's not as strong as the other 2, in my opinion.
That's
Personal opinion.
Hopefully that answers your question, Vineet, but definitely keen. By the way, you've definitely made me think about biometric in a different way as well. But yeah, we'll come back to that one. But I think it's a really interesting differentiation that you've kind of called out. I do want to cover something, just switching gears again. We spoke about identity, we spoke about cross-account, and we spoke about the fact that MFA is probably a really, really good thing. I'm just going to stress again, really, really good thing.
All the things. MFA.
Yeah, all the things. Now, if I want to manage identities, now, obviously, some people are only cloud, some people are hybrid, some people have single sign-on, some people don't have single sign-on. So where do they start with managing identities across this landscape that we've kind of created for ourselves? Is there, and you can go from someone who's cloud ready or cloud build to someone who's hybrid. How do you manage identity across the board? What's your recommendation on that?
My recommendation is to keep it simple. Keep it as simple as possible. Not try to reinvent the wheel, and keep things as standardized as possible. Which is why you said some people are using SSO, some people are not. The people that are not should be using SSO, because that's the best way to leverage whatever you have on-prem and extend that into the cloud and get all the processes for free. Because if not, what you have to do is to create completely separate processes, service desk scripts, policies, etc., just for cloud, and make sure they're consistent with everything else. And now you have another step when someone leaves the company, there's another place people need to go to turn off their account, and people might forget, and then you have a security incident. And so you want to avoid that as much as possible. And then unless you can automate that, right? If you want to keep things separate for some reason, then make sure you can automate that. And depending on your size, that can be even more cost effective than using SSO. I don't know, right? I don't know everyone's situation or scenario, but I would try to leverage what exists as much as possible and to reduce diversity as much as possible. So, for example, and there's a lot to be said about multi-cloud, right?
Yeah.
I tend to think that multi-cloud is a myth. What people actually have is poly-cloud, right? In the sense that you don't have a single workload working on multiple clouds at the same time and switching magically between one another. That I've never seen that. But you can have, I use Office 365, and I don't know, my Windows boxes run on Azure, but then the developers, when they write the code for our e-commerce infrastructure, they're running that on AWS. So each thing is running on one cloud and one cloud only. But having said that, each cloud handles IAM completely differently. If you can standardize in just one of them, whatever it is, I don't know, you love GCP, you go all in on GCP. You love Azure, you're going to go all in on Azure. All of those 3 main cloud providers are really good, and they have pros and cons depending on what you need. Try to focus as much as possible on just one, and go all in on that one, because you're going to talent, people are the greatest bottleneck for security in general and cloud security in particular, right? ISC Square says there's 4 million unfilled positions worldwide on security. And that's just general security. If you think about cloud security, that's a really tight Venn diagram, because cloud talent is also pretty rare, right? And so find a security person that understands cloud. So good luck with that, right? So now if you need a good cloud security person for AWS and another one for Azure and another one for GCP, I mean, how much money do you have, right?
Yep. That is true.
You don't want to put yourself in that position as a manager, as a company. You want to minimize the amount of talent that you need. And so once you define, this is how governance is going to work for AWS, this is how access management, logging, this is how segregation and compartmentalization is going to work for AWS. If you can stick to AWS, or if you do the same for Azure and then you stick to Azure, if you do the same for GCP and you stick to GCP, you're going to make your life a lot easier, which is why companies standardize on database systems. Some companies say, I'm going to just use SQL Server. Some people say, I'm just going to use Oracle, whatever. Because you then don't need like a huge team of DBAs, one for MySQL, one for Postgres, one for... It's crazy, right? You need different packing, backup solutions for each one, because they're all different, right? It's the same thing for cloud. So don't make your job harder by overcomplicating and over-engineering things. try one thing at a time. Try to standardize as much as possible. Piggyback what exists, integrate with what exists as much as possible would be my recommendation.
Oh, and that's perfect because we just got a comment from Louis. Companies want one security person that knows everything. That is so true. It's like they're all looking for a magical person who basically knows all the clouds and can all solve all your problems, but it has to be one person for GCP, AWS, and Azure. And like, I don't know how real this scenario is. It's kind of like asking for someone to have 20 years of cloud experience. Like, cloud didn't exist 20 years ago, but you want 20 years experience in cloud. Like, it's kind of one of those ones. I've got an interesting question from Malini as well. She's asking how to manage root accounts in AWS. What's your recommendation on managing root accounts in AWS?
Root accounts are a liability. That's my main theme here. So root accounts should be put into multiple custody scenarios or on a stored somewhere safe, like in the safe. It's you print out the password. No one knows the entire password. Some person sets half of the password. The other person sets other half of this password. They never see each other's piece of paper. They're stapled together and put that on a safe. It's a break in case of fire scenario, break in case of emergency scenario. You never should use the root account for anything unless there's an emergency or is a disaster. That's what you need to do with the root account. Set 2FA for the root account. And you can save the seed or the QR code in the safe as well. So print the QR code for the 2FA, save it there, then delete it from Google Authenticator. You only use that in case of emergency. And the other thing that you need to keep in mind is when you create new accounts through AWS organizations, right? Those accounts, they have a root user that is based off of the email address you chose when you created each account, which is what, apart from the account ID, is one of the things that uniquely identifies an account on AWS organizations. But it does not have a password set. When you create a new AWS account on AWS organizations, it does not set a password for the root account. So what you need to do immediately after you create an account on AWS organizations is go to the console login page, to the root login page, and then you reset, like I forgot the password for that email, and then set a password in the way I just described with 2FA, print it out, store it in the safe. No one knows the whole thing. No one can access it as the root. And everyone does everything using SSO. That's where you want to get.
Perfect. And I think to your point about, it's funny you mentioned that because a lot of people talk about the whole use of organization as well, and how if you use organization, you don't get access to the root account password for all the sub accounts that you've created underneath the organization. So would you recommend that they should reset the password for those root accounts as well?
So that's the point. It's not that you don't get access. It's not defined. It's empty. It's not that anyone can log in, right? Either, right? It's not like if you just go to the login page and put in an empty password, you can log in. But it's not defined. So here's the thing. Who gets that email? You have to set a valid email address, right, for each root account. That's probably going into a distribution list, right, for IT management or whoever, right, or even maybe finance, because they want to get the billing information. And each company treats, that email address differently. Right? It's typically a distribution list. It's not a person, right? Or it should be anyways. But here's the thing. If you don't set a password, all an attacker needs to do is to try out a few things, and those email addresses could be fairly guessable. And they could send phishing emails to that address or send a reset, and help you and go through the reset process and do social engineering and get access as the root to any of those accounts. So every single AWS account you created, you need to know that the AWS, the root account password is set, that 2FA is enabled, but no one actually has that on their phone. It's like the QR code or the seed is saved somewhere on a break glass in case of fire scenario. That's what you need.
And by the way, just on the comment of the cloud security experience, quite a few agreements over there from a lot of people, from Gerald, Vineet, Malini. And it's an interesting comment from Paul about people assuming enterprise security architect actually knows about the cloud. So that's so true as well. Like, assuming a lot of people actually know about that is so true. I I do want to. I know we're coming kind of towards the tail end of the show as well. I did want to ask, in terms of the conversations you're having with people, what are some of the problem areas around identity, or that people are not talking about enough in the cloud space or in AWS, I guess? What are those things?
So the main thing that I'm seeing is that people are minimizing, and it goes to exactly that comment from Paul.
Yeah.
That we see huge projects, to do lift and shift. I've seen, it's like medium-sized banks that I've talked to, for example. They have this huge project on lift and shift to AWS or to Azure, right? And it's a mandate from the CTO or whatever. And they're spending like $1 million, $2 million on that migration project, and say, okay, what's the training budget for that? Oh, it's like $60,000. So it's going to fail. Immediately, I already know this is going to fail. Because there's no way the existing IT team with no previous cloud experience has any chance of pulling that off. The moment those consultants walk out the door, this is all going to go to hell. It's all going to break immediately, right? And I know IT projects in general have a tendency of not meeting their budgets or deadlines. Those kinds of lift and shift projects are even worse than the average.
Right?
And so the greatest bottleneck is knowledge, is expertise. So one of the biggest line items for any company that's taking cloud seriously is train people, developers, ops people, security people, to give them hands-on capability. Don't send them to certificate training. They're focused on just making them memorize the stuff that's going to be asked on the exam. Send them to actual practical hands-on training. They're going to do stuff. And if they're security people, they're going to break stuff and learn how to defend stuff, right? Because it's a huge problem. And don't even get me started on some of the major training players out there where, for example, they're teaching you how S3 works, right? And then the first thing the instructor does, is make the bucket public because they want to show you how you can access stuff on the browser. And not a word is said, oh, this is dangerous. Don't do this in real life. This is going to be a problem. No. Oh, this is how this warning, you ignore it. You disable this, and then you make it public like this. See, now you can access the object. It's no wonder then that most companies, like 90% plus of the companies we did engagements with at Tenchi, had public blob storage or S3 buckets that shouldn't be public. People are conditioned because they were poorly trained.
I think another great example of this is, the AWS templates as well that AWS gives out, where I think those are ready-made templates for create a WordPress app, like host a web WordPress site, use this one-click template. Most of the times, all those templates, what they have are servers facing the internet, right? There is no concept of you will have a private subnet, which is just private, and then there's a load balancer or any of that. It's more like straight out. It's an EC2 instance, publicly facing, so you can all log into it because that's what you want to do. And then you suddenly look at this like, why would you, doesn't make sense. You just assume that people know this, and then they get hacked.
It's meant like an example, like an educational example, like a toy proof of concept stuff, but people use it in production because they don't know any better. And they don't understand the consequences because they haven't been trained enough, or they don't have the expertise. And so it's actually one of the reasons why Tenchi has training. We did a couple of training sessions in Brazil already, really successful, because it's teaching AWS from first principles, but training is delivered by security people, and at each step of the way. So this is the service, this is how you use it, this is how you break it, this is how you protect it. Break in the sense of breaking into, right? So we do S3, and then we show them how to exploit S3, and then we show them how to protect S3, right? And so and that's really, really unusual, and it's a work of hate, because I did the A Cloud Guru, the stuff. I saw those excessive privileges, like they're training on code pipeline, where this machine here will be created just to deploy code on this S3 bucket. So here's what we do: let's just put on the machine role here. Let's put S3 full access. Because why not, right? Let's just give this machine that only needs to write one file to one bucket access to everything related to S3 in my account. what could possibly go wrong? I went to punch my screen every time I watched the training like that. I said, I'm going to do better. I'm going to do a better training than this.
Yeah, and it's so funny because I think it's, and by the way, it's amazing that you guys are running the training as well, because I saw the same gap, and we've been able to try and to do the same with training. It's so important that there needs to be training from security folks, like I guess like people like yourself, like I'm running one as well. It's really interesting that when the training is coming from people who are developers, no, it's not wrong. It's just that it's a different way of looking at the same thing, right? And I feel like if you look at the AWS training or GCP or whatever, like if you go for a vendor training, they don't really focus from a, so like for example, AWS would talk about these are the services we use for security, but like, okay, but how does it really work in a, I guess, an enterprise context, or how does it work really in like a real world scenario?
So the security training from AWS is focusing on their security specific products. So they're going to be talking about IAM. They're going to be talking about guard duty. They're rarely going to be addressing security enough when they talk about the infrastructure stuff. There's very little they say about security when they talk about EC2, S3, so on and so forth, right? So it's one of those things where we see people making mistakes all the time. And so I was talking about the people, right? The knowledge they have. So that's really important. It's crucial. That's like way, way above everything else is number one. Number two, I would say, is don't lift and shift. It's not going to work. Or if it does, you're missing out. You're getting all of the downside, but you're getting none of the upside. Which is a horrible decision to make. Don't set a deadline to migrate. You should look at the things that are worth migrating, do them one at a time, look at what worked and what didn't, and learn as a company, and then do everything. Don't set a deadline. I'm going to migrate everything. That's really not the way you want to manage your company if you're being responsible, in my opinion. and what this means, typically, the most frequent mistake I've seen is that people are really used to have this one single internal network, even when there is some segregation of VLANs and some internal firewalls, but they expect everything to be routable to everything across the corporate network. The best way you can deploy your AWS or cloud infrastructure, if you don't do that, if you follow that mental model of each AWS account is self-contained, right? And so the challenges you need to surpass in order to achieve that are, okay, I have one, for example, antivirus server that's running on my on-premises data center, right? So how do I get an AWS account that's completely network separated on a network level from my corporate network to still have agents that are reporting to my antivirus server? So you start looking at things like private link, or even establish like a specific site-to-site VPN, but it's really limited to just those communications. So you start looking at that, but you don't try to make everything a single flat network integrated with the corporate network. We don't do network segregation properly on premises environments. Let's not carry that error over by default to cloud accounts, to cloud environments, because we can do it differently.
So true. Yes. I'm just conscious of the time as well. We have a few questions that have come through. One of the questions around, can you recommend how to find these good trainings? I guess I won't really recommend. I mean, I'll let you answer it, but I think we kind of bashed a Cloud Guru a bit. But I think it's still good if you want to start off, but if you go in with a mindset,
So you know what? Good sources of training that I found. So, for example, I personally took the Securosis trainings on Black Hat from Rich Mogul and the team.
Oh, yeah, that was pretty good. Yes,
they're awesome. We've seen Scott Piper this training. So he was planning to have in-person training with Forward Cloud Stack, which is like a cloud-centric security conference he was going to have at the same day as Reinforce. But then Reinforce didn't happen. Forward Cloud Stack was online. I think his training happened online as well. So that's another place to go. And he does have, I think, like in-company trainings or company-specific trainings. Terry Redichel,
she's good as well,
She's awesome. She has amazing training as well.
Yeah.
And if you don't mind a bit of a Brazilian accent on English, we have as well. But those people I said before are way better than we are. So
yeah, and I think it's definitely worthwhile reaching out to people as well, because I think there are only a handful of people that are running these kind of training. But I would definitely, I mean, would you agree when I say you definitely need to have some kind of understanding of the cloud per se, which is kind of where a cloud guru or these kind of folks can, I guess, fill some of that gap. But to put that security lens on top is like, which is kind of like what people like yourself or me or Scott and other people, that's what all of us are doing. We're not teaching, I guess, this is what AWS services are, but this is more like, this is how you look at them. This is how you look at secrets management. This is how you look at identity management. I think that's kind of where the difference is. Worthwhile calling out, because I don't imagine us going, and I'm just talking about the training that I run, that I don't imagine myself specifically trying to do trainings on just one service, if that makes sense. Right? It's like, it's not going to be S3 bucket, but I don't know if you look at it the same way or you look at it differently.
No. So the training we have today, we have a structure of the trainings we're going to have. The first one we have right now is called AWS Cloud Infrastructure Security. So what we did was, if you look at the minimum services every company that's just moving into AWS is going to use, what is the bare minimum they need to do a good job security-wise? So we start with IAM, and so it's a week-long course, right? And we had to cut material because it would be a lot bigger, right? Almost 2 days of just IAM, because IAM is the basis for everything, right? So 2 days of IAM, and then we go into S3, KMS, EC2, and a few things associated with EC2, like Systems Manager, because it can help things like management, patch management, things like that. And then organizations, SSO, and a little bit about CloudTrail and Guard Duty. Just a preview on this course, because we're planning on releasing later this year our AWS monitoring, like Blue Team course. It's going to be 4-day course that ends with a CTF, with a capture the flag, focused on AWS specific monitoring and defense.
Having a cloud CTF has been my dream for so long. I was organizing a conference over here called BSATS Melbourne. Shout out to the BSATS Melbourne folks. And I designed a cloud-based CTF. I was going to be the first one, and I think it was going to be the first one in the world. But I would like to think so. But we had to cancel that because of the whole COVID thing. But I would love for someone to just create a CTF in cloud, because I feel it's so important. But yeah, and I think it kind of goes back to what she was saying as well about the fact that she's looking for more security focused one. I think I'll definitely recommend that, because she said she's taken a few and she's got for security related ones. I think the ones that you mentioned already. So Terry is a good person. Obviously, you can go Tenchi if you want, Scott. I run one as well. So there are a few people who are trying to do security related ones. Quickly skimming through some of the questions, Malini has asked about, is AWS Cognito used widely? It seems to be use a directory kind of service to web apps. Any thoughts on Cognito?
Yeah, Cognito is more applicable if you are developing an app, you have a mobile app, you're developing a web app. It's not so much to control access into your AWS environment, which is what we were talking about more today. It's much more you're an app developer, you're building an app, and you use Cognito in the same way that you would use Auth0 or other services to not have to implement the authentication yourself. And you have a pre-packaged implementation of the authentication, the user storage, etc. It is kind of limited. I would look into alternatives. There's a great research on some security issues with Cognito that was done by Andrés Riancho, which is an Argentinian researcher. I can send you the link later. Maybe you can add it to the show notes.
Yeah, perfect.
Worth reading. It has some limitations. If you're all into AWS, it's going to make life easier for you to not use a third-party service. Then definitely look into it. But keep in mind, that's the use case. You're developing an app, and you want to have a Cognito handle the authentication for you. It's going to work particularly well if you're using API Gateway. It integrates really well with API Gateway, so that could be a design choice for you. But something like Auth0 or one of the alternatives is probably going to be more flexible.
Oh, I think Paul is an active user of Cognito as well. So he uses that for their SaaS solution. I think I've got another question from Malini about how can I audit or assess IAM in AWS?
That's a great question. There's one tool that I'm going to rave about. I cannot stop talking about this tool, and I was going to forget, which is cloud splaining. Cloud splaining is awesome. From Kinder McQuaid, I think is in Salesforce, which is a great tool because what it does, it's still work in progress. Anyone is welcome to contribute. If I had more time, I would be contributing already. Which is a great tool. What it does, there's a specific particular command in IAM, which I forget right now, which basically dumps all of the IAM users, groups, roles, and all the privileges they have and the relationships between them all in a big JSON. What it does, it gets that, and then it checks all of the permissions that were granted to users or roles and draws your attention to anything that's dangerous. So it's going to highlight anything that has the capabilities of leading to privilege escalation or to data exfiltration. So any dangerous permissions that were granted. And so it's really powerful because you can automate that. You can run that once a week and just look at the report and see what's changed and use that as a basis for an audit. It's going to really scale really well. So that's one that really helps. Policy Sentry by Scott Piper is another one that I really like, but it's on the other end of the spectrum. It's helping you write good policies. So it's a way to simplify the way you write correct policies. Instead of writing the full JSON or YAML of the IAM policy, you have a simplified thing saying, I'm going to give read privileges to S3, this S3 bucket. I'm going to give write privileges to this SQ. And it's going to then generate, because it knows which operations are read or write or configuration on each service. So it makes the job a lot easier. Because here's the real problem. If people don't understand all the permissions they're going to give, they're going to try 1, 2, 3 times. There's an action missing. Oh, what the hell? I'm just going to put asterisk there. That's what you want, right? So Policy Sentry will probably generate a slightly over permissive policies in the sense that if you give read, it's going to give all of the reads, right? But it's a lot better than people giving up and just going with asterisks, which happens a lot in real life.
It does. It does. And I think it's worthwhile calling out that there are definitely some challenges I think you touched on this earlier. There are 7,000 actions for IAM, right? 7,000. Like, it's not even practical to think about. And if you try to bring your on-premise knowledge of different kinds of groups that you can come in, it's like so many complexities to it. But I think there are definitely some great tools you mentioned. So I'm going to add that to the show notes. So I'll take that from you. And that's kind of like the last question from Malini. Just conscious of the time as well. There's an AWS policy generator as well, which kind of is all right. I feel like it still doesn't do a great job. Like UI, I think the UI sucks of a policy generator though. But
question is which one, right? Because if you go on SSO, there's one generator. If you go on console, there's another one. So AWS is great. The technology is wonderful. They do not exactly excel in UX and also on cross-product functionality. I think it's a feature of how they structure their organization, where each product team is kind of working independently, and so they have they are very free to innovate, and so that's why you see so many releases and new features, and they evolve so fast. But at the same time, if you look at how long it takes for a new service to be supported in CloudFormation, or things like that, right? Because the teams don't talk to each other that much because they're running independently. So it's an organizational choice that affects how it works. And the console being a shared thing, I think, suffers from the same problem. It's inconsistent at times.
Yep, and I think I've just shared the link for Malini as well. Paul just mentioned Cognito is bi-directional, so can use in both directions. Just trying to see if I've missed anything. No, just talk about the courses. Sweet. All right, cool. I think we've answered most of the questions. So, but I will encourage people to reach out to you as well if they have any other follow-up questions. So this is towards the end of our show, and I've got these 3 fun questions that I ask people just to get to know the non-technical side of those folks as well. So Alex, what do you spend most time on when you're not working on cloud or technology?
Interesting. So these days, not much because I'm locked away in my house because of
Fair
COVID.
enough.
But before that, I was I practice Aikido, which is a Japanese modern Japanese martial art,
Yep.
more like a therapy than anything else. It's non-competitive. It's not. I'm not trying to be like a badass and cast or anything like that. But it's really a form of therapy, and it's something that you get better at increasingly. Increasingly, it's very complex. It's cooperative, so it's a really great way to relax and exercise. I'm a sci-fi fan, so I watch a lot of movies. I try to read as much as possible. Um, and I try to contribute to conferences. I'm DMC for a Brazilian conference that's going to happen next week, for example. I did the conference talk on DEF CON, which, by the way, we haven't mentioned, right? So this
Yes.
whole topic of cross-account access, if you go to DEF CON Cloud Village, there's a YouTube channel for that. I did a talk. But as far as non-work related stuff, I love animals. I have 5 cats.
You have 5 cats.
I have. There's one right here. If you look at the video on Cloud Village, the Thor, this one,
Yeah.
you can actually see him. Let me see if you're able to see him there.
Oh, yes, I can.
I actually work from his office. He's gracious enough to let me work here.
Oh, wow. So Thor is gracious enough to allow.
Use it occasionally.
Yeah.
And I love martial arts. Actually, the name of the company, Tenchi, is a Japanese name, which means heaven and earth, based on the name of a particular move in Aikido that's called Tenchi Nage, which is one way in which you can throw an opponent. It's heaven and earth because you take one hand of the opponent very close to the ground and the other one very high, and the person gets unbalanced and falls. And so,
okay, good to know. I've got another couple of questions for you as well. What is something that you're proud of but not on social media?
the team I was able to bring to Tenchi. The thing that makes me proudest right now is just the people I was able to gather around me. If you want to be successful, you need to be surrounded with people that are way smarter, more competent than you. And I still cannot believe I convinced that bunch of people to work with me on the company that we're just building from scratch.
Yep, that is true. It's
So
I can't imagine, like, I think it's one thing to start something on your own as an individual, but then it's another to kind of get others behind the same mission. So yeah, definitely kudos to you guys, man.
and a huge responsibility as well, because people are leaving their jobs and they're going to rely on the company financially, and so I do not take that for granted. But if you look at our blog, some of the research, like Rodrigo Montoro, Danny Dilking, the people I have, I'm really, really, really happy and proud of that.
That's awesome. And I can't wait to have some of those folks on the show as well one day. Final question. What's your favorite cuisine or restaurant that you can share?
Interesting. I really love Italian and Spanish cuisine. My parents are Spaniards. I'm
All right.
technically a Spanish citizen as well, so I'll do my own tortilla de huevos.
Oh, nice. Oh my God. I would love to have them. But because I only have like a very small introduction to the Spanish food. Thanks to I've got a few Mexican friends here, and they've introduced me to this whole new world that I didn't know existed beyond tacos. I'm like, how is it like people were not talking more about the other food, other Spanish food apart from tacos? But yeah. Sorry, go on. I'm just quite excited there.
No, that's okay. That's okay. And Italian food as well. So we were talking about Brazil earlier, right? So I have this huge Spanish influence because my parents are Spanish, and a lot of modified dishes that I ate growing up that even people in Brazil don't know about because of the Spanish heritage. But Italian is really huge here in Brazil. When Brazil abolished slavery, there was a lot of European immigration into Brazil, and so there are regions in Brazil that people only speak German to this day. My wife is from the south of Brazil. She only started to learn the country's official language, Portuguese, when she started going to school. Her father has really thick German accent when he speaks Portuguese, and so she speaks fluent German. And so they have German food and Italians. I mean, we have a huge amount. We had a huge amount of Italian immigrants. So the pizza in São Paulo is probably one of the best in the world outside of Italy. And I know people from New York are going mad at me right now. I dare them to come here and
I was going to say, yeah. I was going to say, yeah, I was going to say, like, all the New Yorkers are going to be like, what? how can you have? We have the best pizza in the world. Yeah, I think I definitely have to say I must say you represented Brazil quite well, because towards the end you've managed to have like a good tourism. Yeah, I know. You've managed to get the tourism going up as well, like with the Italian population, German population, so much good food, amazing pizza. That sounds perfect, man. Where can people find you if they have any follow-up questions and stuff? Where can they find you?
So I'm on Twitter as Alexandre Sieira. It's probably if you include the link on the show notes, because I
Yes,
didn't
I will.
my full name, which is a
Yeah.
horrible mistake.
That's okay.
And Asiera at tenchysecurity.com. Actually, go to tenchysecurity.com, and you're going to find my email, my profile there. We have a blog with a few interesting things we posted that you might find interesting. And that's the easiest way to find it.
Awesome. Cool. All right. I can't wait to have you guys have you back again, and some other folks from Tenchi as well. But thanks for joining me, man. I really appreciate you coming in.
Thank you for inviting me. It was a great pleasure.
Thank you. All right.